Thank you very much, Melissa. I'm Charles Palermo, professor of modern art history, mostly European, at the Department of Art and Art History next door. I'm here to introduce our speaker this afternoon. She's an artist, an art historian, and an authority on 19th century French painting, Margaret MacNamidhe. She currently teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She is also a graduate of an art school, Ireland's National College of Art and Design. She worked originally as a painter. Her work is in public collections in Dublin. Here is an example of Margaret's recent work, a painting after a worn 19th century Greek coin, which I think you'll agree with me is lovely. I show it to you not only because it's lovely, a lovely painterly example of her work, but also because it helps us to see and to remember her activity as an artist, which informs her art historical work much to our benefit. Her decision to turn to art history led to a Fulbright scholarship, which brought her to the United States, where she entered the Ph.D. program in the history of art at Johns Hopkins University. There, among other things, she met me. Despite varying degrees of geographical separation, we have remained friends since then. Margaret is the author of a 2015 study on French Romantic painting titled Delacroix and His Forgotten World, The Origins of Romantic Painting. In it, Margaret restores to its historical conditions the reception of Delacroix's early work, especially his now universally admired Massacre at Chios, using contemporary criticism to put it in relation to the waning tradition and values of Davidian painting. In recent years, she has turned away from this part of the European 19th century. Margaret's recently completed book focuses on the question of how we learn, and in particular, how we acquire different kinds of skills, notably the skill of drawing. In fact, her book, a chapter from it has been published in a peer-reviewed open access online journal called nonsite.org, of which I'm an editor, argues that art historical accounts of drawing in the West have not been given just due to certain kinds of pedagogical literature, drawing manuals, how-to guides, studies of children's drawing, critical to understanding the history of drawing since the late 19th century. Central to this overlooked body of pedagogical literature is its discussion of the hand's grasp of the pencil, stick of charcoal, etc. The non-site essay opened my own eyes to a clear and central reference to one such grip in a major early work of Pablo Picasso's, a key painting within a body of work I thought I knew. The perspective of a trained artist is invaluable in understanding works of art. This evening, she takes us back to the early years in the career of Edgar Degas in order to look at the remarkable variety of work, group portraiture history painting, that he produced in the late 1850s and 1860s. So please join me in welcoming Margaret MacNamidhe, please.
Thank you so much, Charles. That was a really wonderful introduction. We all know why Charles is such a popular professor here in William and Mary, and you're so lucky to have him on campus as resident authority on 20th century painting. So I'm delighted to be here, and I also want to thank Melissa Paris, Laura, I've forgotten her second name already, but Laura and Lauren, who have been, Laura Fogarty, excuse me, how could I forget, who've been just wonderful and have been treating me like royalty for the past few days. So it feels like a few days. I've never want to leave at this point. But I arrived just yesterday and I've been treated so well already. Thank you. I will start. Just one key thing that I'm going to mention before I launch into my discussion, which is that the printmaking part has, can everyone hear me? Oh, I can take off my mask. Oh, yes, excuse me. Okay, that's much better. So I was very muffled, presumably. Okay, so the printmaking part has, and now you can hear me, yes, thank you. has disappeared a little bit, but hopefully there won't be any deficits in what you're about to hear. So my bread and butter as a teacher of art history in an art school is courses on Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. I begin by noting that it's through posters, t-shirts, tote bags, fridge magnets, mugs, face masks, and scarves, such as the one I'm showing at the top of the screen, and other commodified means that a large number of people encounter Impressionism. I should stand a little bit closer to this. Sections of drawings, oil paintings, pastels, and prints by key members of the Society of Independent Artists, as the Impressionists call themselves, are in constant circulation. I also always say to my students how intriguing it is that merchandising has been able to wring so much from the oeuvre of Edgar Degas. Michel Foa has pointed out, and here I'm giving a shout out to the next lecturer, honored by Charles Palermo's kind invitation to contribute to this series, that Degas is an artist who reveled in the materiality of his art. Nevertheless, the popularity of Degas is due in large part to the perception that what we see are candid, spontaneous scenes caught on the fly, a notion I will be arguing against this evening in relation to the early work. What I'm going to suggest is that a particular concept, that of the pause, can focus a host of characteristics that are embedded in the life's work of this artist. These are the characteristics I have in mind. First, there is a reluctance to picture the face directly. There's a reluctance in the first place to picture the face directly, by which I mean an absence of comprehensive physiognomic immediacy. In second place, there are static poses that are sometimes oddly formal, as we saw in the study of the ballet dancer in the previous slide. In third place, there's a discomfort with oil paint, which I will argue is related to that exact interest in Quattrocento painting spotlighted in the Muscarelle Museum. Especially for my purposes this evening, Piero della Francesco and Andrea Mantegna, a copy of which is shown upstairs. And I believe that this interest encouraged Degas to apply oil paint to canvas so that it looked like fresco. And last, there is an interesting repetition and mirroring of figures, both within a single passage of work and between works. These can help to bring together the various strands of Degas' practice by articulating an irresolvable vacillation about the nature of depicted time, which I will characterize this evening as the pause. To begin with the first point, the reluctance to picture the face, and this is actually in the show too. I was just so thrilled to see the exhibition upstairs. It's like, wow, this exhibition has been waiting for this talk. And as this is in the second room, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's a very small work. It's a monoprint. It's an exceptionally small but eye-catching work. And it directly exemplifies Degas' usually more circumspect or partial unwillingness to depict the face. His aversion to lingering on the face has been noted by a host of commentators. For example, the scholar S. Hollis Clayson has remarked on the way, and I'll just take this. Don't forget to see the Quattrocento works now, but I'll just be putting that up there. Remarked on the way that the shapes of the new electric lights in the scene you see on your left, one of many in which Degas pictured a singer in the midst of entertaining a cafe audience, are echoed by the head of the singer in a kind of morphological correspondence. This also means that in Degas' work, emotion isn't necessarily conveyed by faces, unless there is also a gesture in the mix, such as the outstretched arm of the cafe singer, or here on the right, and in a more typically static pose, which is number 2 on my list of characteristics, the crossed arms of the ballet dancer. This painting, Ballet Dancer with Arms Crossed, is also a typical example of a work executed by Degas in the 1870s that demonstrates the artist's reluctance to picture the face directly. Yet Degas began his career partly by working in the genre of portraiture, There are absolutely wonderful examples in the Muscarelle exhibition, including this beautiful study of Mademoiselle Dombrowska, a study to the sisters depicted in the Bellelli family portrait that we'll see later on. And not just the particularly familiar genre of the single figure portrait, but in other kinds of portraiture besides, especially the group portrait and the double figure portrait. And the face is figure painting's traditional mode of address. It is that, quote, eloquent, significant being, unquote, from which the painter can make a choice of emphasis, unquote. That's from the 20th century poet Paul Valéry in his meditation called Degas, Dance, Dessin from 1938. And so it's especially interesting that even in the years when he was exhibiting with the independent artists, Degas avoided depicting faces and did so in several different ways. But I haven't yet fulfilled my obligation to go through the rest of the items on the list. I'll develop the third one, Degas' discomfort with oil paint, later on. The fourth item on my list is repetition and mirroring, and that brings me to a star work in the Muscarelle show, the marvelous color lithograph executed with Auguste Clos before the race. We see again in this work the familiar unwillingness to delineate a front view of the face. The bodies have a somewhat attenuated form, quite typical for Degas. And here I also want to note that an oblique view of a scene is a typical preference of his. The repetition and mirroring are evident in the back legs of the horse at the very back in relation to the horse just in front of it. Degas even has the left back leg of the distant horse looking like it's touching a back leg of its neighbor in front. In fact, these two back legs join up with the horse in the middle foreground, creating an odd, repeated, enlarging pattern that takes a moment to decipher. Now, I don't claim that Degas was spelling out to himself my list of 4 characteristics. Rather, they all follow from his growing awareness in the crucial years of the 1850s and 1860s of the significance of different genres of painting. In particular, I want to explore Degas' sense of the tableau, an ambitious form of painting that I'll define, and Degas' associated interests in certain aspects of the hierarchy of genres. This view of the 19th century Paris salon helps us visualize a routinely crammed exhibition. In the hierarchy of genres, still life was at the bottom, landscape nearly at the bottom, portraiture and increasingly group portraiture more of a step forward, and finally at the top rung and on by far the largest scale, the genre of history painting. The onus was then on the painter, who, having been given the advantage of scale for the means of delivery, had to come up with a picture which transmitted what it had to say all the way to the cheap seats, as it were, a painting which beamed itself across crowded spaces. But the responsibility of any individual painting was to stamp itself out on those jam-packed walls. This weighed on any painter keen to make a successful painting during the considerable number of decades, indeed well over a century, when the salon was a dominant arena. As many of you this evening already know, it's even possible to say that it was the salon, or rather the increasingly restrictive salon jury, which might have been responsible for Impressionism in the first place. As Paul Tucker, Charles Moffat, Joel Isaacson, Paul Smith, Martha Ward, and other scholars have pointed out, these artists cohered as a group largely because of their shared frustration with the salon system. And here I'm showing the huge studio of the photographer Nadar, which served as the venue for the inaugural exhibition for the Society of Independent Artists in 1874. But the ideal of the salon as a destination for the public and for public art, and the traditional ranking system of the hierarchy of genres did not just tumble asunder as we might think. The artists themselves craved for their paintings the same kind of enduring significance which meant a permanent place in the museum, as had been awarded to the painters of yore, be they the great neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David with his Oath of the Horatii, or his descendants in pictorial ambition, such as the Romantic painter Theodore Géricault. A detail of his famous painting, The Raft of the Medusa, is shown on the left. By examining generation after generation of salon reviews, art criticism in which the term tableau was consistently privileged, the art historian Michael Fried made the original identification of the tableau. Capitalizing on this discovery, Martha Ward has noted how the premium that Impressionist painting came to place in originality, its appeal to the viewer, as you see on the right-hand slide, came at a cost to traditional procedures for attaining the tableau. Impressionism's rapid autographic brushwork was, as Richard Schiff has told us, a guarantee of an individualized, authentic response to an unprecedented moment. But it precipitated Impressionism's devolution into what were seen as the movement's, quote, fragmented productions, to quote Ward. Furthermore, the ideal and actuality of the museum, as seen on the right, as a destination for advanced painting, was being replaced by the temporary exhibition and the domestic interior, leading to what Ward calls a, quote, privatized aesthetics, unquote, which would not ultimately, quote, satisfy and endure like the, unquote, like the tableau from the past. By returning to the outset of Degas' career, we can see how talismanic the achievement of the tableau remained even as enormous change was afoot. In November 1858, this ambition was spelled out when Degas wrote from Florence to a senior figure in Paris's artistic circles, the painter Gustave Moreau, his then close friend, expressing his hope that the group portrait Degas hoped to begin of his aunt's family was to be a tableau, a word he repeats and underlines. Degas wrote to Moreau that he had an inordinate wish, quote, an inordinate wish, a fine vision, to bring forth a tableau, unquote. Degas duly began working on the idea for the group portrait known as the Bellelli family in Florence in 1858, where his relatives, that is, the Bellelli family, lived. Armed with a great number of studies, he started work on the canvas itself sometime in the middle of 1860, after his 3 years in Italy, installing himself in a Paris studio actually ample enough to accommodate major salon-scale paintings. Rising to the highest point in this composition, we see the figure of Laura Bellelli, Degas' aunt, who is flanked by her 2 daughters, Giovanna by her mother's side and the seated Giulia. Both wear black dresses and white pinafores. They're turned towards the viewer, even though Giulia turns her head sharply to the side as she gazes at some unidentifiable point in the distance. Laura gazes in the same direction as her daughter Giulia. Laura adopts black mourning dress. The framed portrait on the wall behind her depicts her father, Hilaire Degas, who had recently died. The 4th figure in the group is the husband of Laura and father of Giovanna and Giulia, Gennaro Bellelli. He sits apart from his wife and daughters. His face is in profile and his back is to the viewer. 2 topics are relevant to a full consideration of this group portrait. Both are beyond the scope of my presentation this evening, but I want to note them. First, there is the room we see. This kind of upholstered, highly patterned, bourgeois interior has been seen, notably by Walter Benjamin, as a key site of subject formation in the 19th century. Art historians and literary critics from Susan Sidlauskas, Liz Pretajohn, T.J. Clark, Sharon Marcus, and Marnan Young have taken valuable cues from Benjamin to elaborate this theme. The second topic, beyond my scope this evening, is the case of this particular bourgeois family. According to correspondence between Degas and his aunt, Laura held a low opinion of Gennaro, and their relationship was more than a little strained. Emphasizing the family ties emphasizing the familiar ties, the family ties between Edgar Degas and Laura Bellelli, Commentators have noted that the separate island, as it were, inhabited by Gennaro should be attributable to the split between the parents. What matters, I suggest, is not whatever suppositions we might be able to construct about a particular situation, but instead an intricate dialogue of proffered and refused interior states as our eyes connect with the one figure who meets our gaze, while all the other figures remain sunk in their thoughts. This evening, I link the Bellelli family to other examples of group portraiture occurring at the same time, including other works of Degas in order to evaluate his wish to, quote, bring forth a tableau, unquote. I suggest that we bring this degree of ambition into accord with ambitions pursued by a group which spanned 2 generations. On the one hand, we have the familiar grouping of the Impressionists, but on the other, we have that generation to which Degas belonged age-wise, but with whom he isn't always associated. Born as he was in 1834, he was part of a generation slightly older than the main Impressionist group, closer, in fact, to the painters Henri Fantin-Latour and Edouard Manet, born in 1836 and 1832, respectively, than he was to Claude Monet or Auguste Renoir, both of whom were born in the 1840s. This is a group that Fried has called the generation of 1863, a group of artists shown in this painting, which, not coincidentally, is a group portrait. The figure with the palette in the foreground is the painter himself, Henri Fantin-Latour. The others include James McNeill Whistler, whose name crops up in the Muscarelli's exhibition's final room, and who was then an up-and-coming painter from the US. He's standing just in front of Fantin, and then there are 2 seated critics on the right, and between them is Manet. In fact, the stakes were set particularly high for a new kind of group portraiture, and Fantin-Latour felt obliged to paint example after example of this exact specialized genre. In this second group portrait by Fantin, known as the Studio at the Batignolles, we have another opportunity to consider the overlap between different generations. Fantin isn't depicting himself at the easel, however, in this case. Instead, the artist is the immaculately attired Edouard Manet, holding, I might note, the paintbrush with a pen grip. The seated subject, we presume, of the portrait is the critic and artist Zachary Astruc, who sits at Manet's side. To name just the best-known figures from this portrait, right in front of the framed painting is the Impressionist artist Auguste Renoir wearing a hat. Then we see the realist novelist Émile Zola, the brilliant but short-lived Impressionist painter Frédéric Bazille, he's the tall one, and Claude Monet, he's on the extreme right. It's not just that the genre of group portraiture itself was increasingly being identified as the very site of advanced painting. Arresting compositional effects were also being tried out. One powerful effect was especially popular. It was one which contrasted those captivating inner states on the part of some figures with stares straight out of the composition by others. Thus, for example, in the Studio at the Batignolles, we see the painter who paints, plainly depicted in the throes of concentration, and that focus enthralls many of the figures in the group, but not all, and therein lies the rub. A similar dynamic pertains in the Bellelli family, where the figure of the standing daughter is given a stare straight out at us. In fact, the more we look at these compositions, the more we appreciate the task of constructing what looks like the serene, but in fact fiendishly complicated exercise of the group portrait. I suggest then that we see in this development of a new kind of portraiture in the late 1850s and early 1860s, the operation of what Fried has called a double structure. One group of figures remains focused on an inner state, but at the very same time, another figure looks out of the composition to meet our gaze. This is exactly the structure that pertains in the Bellelli family. Yet, in order to explore Degas' work, It's important not to forget, during these years, it's important not to forget the sheer variety of pictures he was producing at the time. On the bottom, for example, is a large-scale history painting that he was dedicated to at the very same time as the Bellelli family, and it's called The Daughter of Jephthah. What I suggest we hold in mind when looking at these seemingly disparate works is the sense of protraction for Degas, both temporal in terms of the years he remains obsessed with these projects, and also pictorial in terms of the duration implied within these early paintings. The question of a dilation of time turns up in a particularly compelling way in the strange history paintings like The Daughter of Jephthah. Their time seems not only to be protracted, but distended. The Old Testament Jephthah from the Book of Judges has been victorious on the battlefield, and to give thanks to God, he pledges to sacrifice the first living being he sees on the way home. But this turns out to be his own daughter. And here is Jephthah on horseback, attempting to shield his eyes. His sword is raised, but he has reflexively turned aside. A warrior in a yellow shirt keeps his sword or palm upraised and faces the group that includes Jephthah's daughter. Like the Bellelli family, the painting involves awkward, static figures caught in a protracted moment of time. And let's move to another strange history painting with a subject of inflamed drama, a scene of war in the Middle Ages. We see in this figure, I suggest, a moment where time seems protracted and distended, an effect that is made especially emphatic because the scene as a whole, as in several of these early history paintings, seems devoted to the most violent narrative action. And here, in young Spartan girls provoking boys, we see a duel between two opposing groups of figures. The moment appears simultaneously pulled and, as it were, frozen. But let's linger a bit more on The Daughter of Jephthah. Its narrative action centers on what we can call a violence of vision, that terrible moment when Jephthah's vow to sacrifice the first living being he sees on his return inflicts enormous pain on him. But Degas' painting drains the terrible acknowledgement of anguish and affect. Jephthah, in the foreground, is awkwardly transfixed, holding up a shriveled arm to avert his gaze, and his daughter appears on a distant hill as a tiny, swooning, summarily painted figure with stiffly extended arms. At the very center of the composition, a headless, legless dog left hanging in mid-leap distracts from the central moment. Even those raised swords and palms I mentioned earlier, along with the active poses of the soldiers and female attendants, appear enervated, sapped by the undulating lines and the faded greens of the landscape setting. And let's cut back to the Bellelli family for a comparison. Note the presence of a dog left only partially rendered, hanging on at the right-hand side of the composition. You can just see it way over there to the right. And there is a further strange early foray into strange history painting that I'd like to show you. Here is the Semiramis building Babylon, and we find that here too, Degas found it challenging to sustain a narrative motif of action. The composition is inspired by the story of the Neo-Assyrian queen Semiramis, who is said to have restored the walls of Babylon. We see a pared down, blocky, effaced, strangely insubstantial, monumental setting against which a procession of women are poised. There is a lack of action to the figures, a sense of interruption, a slowing down, even a kind of automatism, and it is enhanced by the recourse to what we might call an archaic or archaizing mode of application, one that is evident in pose, composition, and facture. And with this, I return to my third theme, a discomfort with oil paint, which I think is specifically related to that topic spotlighted by the exhibition, Degas' interest in Quattrocento painting. And in this case, I'm going to emphasize Piero della Francesca and Mantegna. I suggest that the Semiramis invokes Piero della Francesca in its hushed, strangely stilled formality. Although Degas left behind no specific copy after Piero, the art historian Geneviève Monnier has proposed that the scenes of the Queen of Sheba in Piero's cycle depicting the legend of the true cross in Arezzo were a model for him. Indeed, there is a strangely mottled sky, or more precisely, a rasped and gritty area along the top of the Semiramis, redolent of fresco technique, and some things appear specifically borrowed from Piero's fresco in Arezzo: the slowed procession, the frieze, the hieratic poses, the lack of a focus, a figure leading a horse, and the special emphasis on the kneeling woman to the right. In Piero's composition, she is the Queen of Sheba. Moreover, the spatial repetition to develop my fourth theme of the two prominent figures in black in the Semiramis, as well as the two figures on the right over the horse's back, who form a symmetrical pair, offer a parallel to the female figures to the left of A Scene of War in the Middle Ages, turning one way and then the other, except that those figures are turned further around, pushed seemingly toward the side of the frame itself. All of these poses may also contain echoes of Piero. And we also find that a shadow hangs over A Scene of War in the Middle Ages, where we receive the sense that the figures at the center of the so-called action are adrift in an empty locus, drawing back or leaning forward with infinite languor. That effect of emptying or stilling the center recurs in the young Spartan girls provoking boys. The center of the composition in A Scene of War in the Middle Ages is not empty, but the action seems stilled. The center of the composition in young Spartan girls provoking boys contains distant figures and is effectively empty. But in both paintings, the result is the same: a center devoid of the drama we would expect from a normative history painting. In these paintings, the effect is of a ravaged landscape and an embalmed action, and I would offer this as a way of approaching them rather than one art historian's comment that A Scene of War in the Middle Ages is a, quote, display of pointless and exaggerated cruelty, unquote, and that Semiramis looks like a, quote, courageous, wicked, widowed queen, builder of the Babylonian Empire, pausing momentarily to gaze off as if to regard her destiny, unquote. Rather, this seems an almost somnolent figure, seen in profile, dressed in white, in an endlessly drawn-out moment as she stands on the brink of a precipice, suspended as if in a deep trance. Overall, then, in these paintings, the effect is of a motionless landscape and a suspended action. I note, too, that in all of his most ambitious paintings of the 1850s and 1860s, Degas pays particular attention to isolated female figures who become the axis of his narratives. As a result, I believe we can divine in these early works not a welter of juvenile essays, incomprehensible in their variety, but an array of oils and on canvas, unified by enigmatic characters such as the fainting daughter in the Jephthah, the sleepwalking Semiramis, or the stunned or bowing female figures in A Scene of War in the Middle Ages. They appear as if locked in their own worlds. In the Bellelli family, it is Laura Bellelli who is shown in a pose of stillness, except in this case, it is one marking a variation on the states which, in the history paintings, are almost completely unconscious, whether somnolent or wilting. Her pose gives her the leading figural role within the group, standing to mark the highest point in the composition, resting her right hand on daughter Giovanna's right shoulder. There are still more links between this array of initially dissimilar works. Consider the frieze-like arrangement of the composition of the Bellelli family. Note its emphatic frontality, or its opposite in the figure of the father because he is turned away, and the shallow space. We're not that far from the tipped-up foreground and strangely tilting planes of landscape and figures in The Daughter of Jephthah, where no glimpse of sky is permitted. In fact, it seems as though nothing could be more frontally arrayed than the Bellelli family, with its figures carefully placed on the shallow stage. But on the evidence of a preparatory pastel, it appears that once the conception was even more frontal, as well as being much less spatially complex, with the stage-like floor extending even farther down. This floor seems to push and grow with agitated vertical slashes up the picture plane. In the painting itself, the floor is not a neutral foil, but is executed in a murky mixture of mustard and grey, with a typical disparity in facture, in which no pattern or particular texture can be even discerned. I suggest that this handling recalls the strangely mottled, frescoed sky in the Semiramis, and I would connect both paintings to the same thematic of stilled time, time that has, as it were, gelled, both historically and in terms of its viewing, and in its terms of viewing, I should say. And in fact, more can be said about this mottled materiality of handling, but you'll undoubtedly return to this exact topic during Michel Faua's lecture. In these terms, a pause would be understood as an absorptive moment, part of a construction of unself-consciousness, and words like protraction and dilation would belong to the possibilities of artifice that address the viewer. The juxtaposition of natural pause and forced dilation is present not just across compositions, but in virtually every figure Degas painted in the 1850s and 1860s. In the Bellelli family, each figure is partly unaware and partly artificial. Laura stands stock still as if in a reverie, but her left hand is curved uncomfortably on the table, and each daughter is partly relaxed and partly self-conscious. The split is also figured in the distinction between the absorption of the faces and the shallow space, and it occurs again in the contrast between the play of reflected spaces in the detail from the Bellelli family that I'm showing you on the left of this slide, the stacked spaces and the stacked spaces of the Jephthah on the right, whose difficulties of decipherment are borne out in the once inaccurately titled study for this exact section of this exact canvas, which is on display in the Muscarelli's first gallery. But what we see in each case are obfuscations that prevent any imaginative ingress. I've also mentioned Piero, and here I turn to another Quattrocento artist, Andrea Mantegna. A detail of his St. Sebastian in the Louvre is on the right, while also returning to the teacherly role played by Gustave Moreau in Degas' early career. During the period of the 1850s and early 1860s, Degas, Moreau, Manet, Alphonse Legros, Bazille, and others shared an interest in the particular qualities of the Quattrocento. Moreau encouraged Degas to embark on experiments in technique, which would become a hallmark of his life's work. But it's significant that Moreau issued specific guidelines. Watercolor, Moreau said, should evoke the matte tones and gentleness of fresco, unquote. And even specific parts of frescoes can be imitated by using distemper, gouache, and pastel. Here is where Mantegna is conjured in Moreau's Oedipus and the Sphinx, seen on the left, in crystalline, petrified detail, which contributed to the valorization of will in the snapping shot of the absorptive moment that Frida's identified as crucial to its success at the 1864 Salon. You see on your left a copy by Degas of Mantegna's Calvary, and on the right, the original itself. And again, this exhibition offers us an opportunity to appreciate how much Degas was inspired by this exact work. I'm not saying that Degas used Mantegna in the same way as did Moreau. Indeed, far from propelling the image toward closure, Degas seems to have been more interested in the unsettling potential of Mantegna's stoniness, abstractness, and even a sense of awkwardness. I am suggesting that Moreau and Degas might be seen to share a more general sense of Mantegna that has yet to be explored. And here is a closer look at the slack handling of paint in the copy that Degas made in 1861 of Mantegna's Calvary, very much unlike the handling that Moreau would have used. An exquisite page of studies from 1858 sums up Degas' obsession with the Quattrocento, and again the fact that his history painting, copying, and portraiture were all in progress at much the same time. On this sheet, which parallels exactly the Muscarelli's exhibition 1857 Portrait of the Artist's Father and Other Studies, the whispered delicacy of the central image evokes the original silver point of the head. At the time, it was attributed to Leonardo, surrounded by a portrait head, sepia washes, life studies, and a, quote, bonneted head of a girl, unquote, that may be one of the Bellelli family. A contemporary comment by Degas about fresco is salient here. It was recorded by the innovative dealer Ambroise Vollard among the first figures in the circle of the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists to seize upon the popularity of drawing, including the potential of drawings to be sold as autonomous, fully fledged works of art. Degas said that he harbored an ambition to, quote, paint on walls, unquote. This comment bespeaks a desire to fulfill a dream shared by many a 19th century painter to embark upon great monumental schemes that would outpace the private market and bring them closer to what Ward has described as the museum as a, quote, powerful imaginary, unquote. But it also tells us something else. I believe that Degas indicates here his wish to paint as painting is done on walls. Degas' tactile experimentation in the studio must have had that interest in fresco as one of its mainstays. Now I'd like to bring together the strands I've been exploring up till this point. First, the four themes with which I began. I've been arguing that these are among the principal concerns Degas brought to his wish to generate a tableau during the 1850s and 1860s. And throughout, I've been suggesting that the particular temporal structure that can be glimpsed in everything that we've been looking at so far this evening might be summed up in terms of the concept of the pause. In the studio at the Batignolles, we saw a scene where the depicted figures failed to fall under the spell of the small but captivating drama of which they were a part. Looking again, we cannot help but note how we register the gazes of the two figures looking straight out of the canvas in order to acknowledge our own looking at them. In Degas' paintings, including this one, Sulking from 1870, this acknowledgement coexists with the pause, which I conceive as a particularly extended temporal opening within a scene in which a figure is marked as remaining still in a position of weakness or enigma, thus distending the depicted moment in a way which isn't legible or comprehensible. The painted representation of a steeplechase on the wall behind fortifies the sense I've just described. We see a horse and jockey not just pausing, but actually balking before a jump. Whether it is the majestic but strangely insubstantial figure of Laura Bellelli, Note again that oddly limp hand wilting onto the table, or the somnolent, floating figure of Semiramis. The pause cannot be pinned down to a paradigm of anticipation, tension, reflection, disengagement, automatism, or reverie, even as it gathers up all of those connotations and conjures more in regard to Degas' work, both in this period in which I'm concentrating and later. The pause is irreducible to the hackneyed references to conventional markers of time, the themes of rest, hiatus, break, and aftermath that have familiarly been identified in Degas' paintings. It's not as if we could pluck from time a paradigm of something called a pause. Rather, the pause is the structure of the work, the particular frozenness that makes the portraits possible, just as the strangely failed dramas of the history paintings can be understood as their conditions of possibility. What then of Degas' aspiration to paint a tableau in his letter of 1858? In a way, Degas is too slow, spending several years painting a group portrait. But that slowness did not make of the Bellelli family a traditional tableau. On the one hand, therefore, Degas was too slow to ever finish. He vacillated, he worried constantly. On the other, he was also too impatient. He turned instead to drawing, to printmaking, and to an increasingly obsessive experimentation with media. He would not only abandon oil painting, but he would go on to experiment at full tilt, so that he would no longer have to remain tethered to the autonomous image in which he would sink time and frustrated energy. He would crumble, sharpen, and even water down pastel. He would tear up canvas and paper alike. He would add and subtract pieces from larger works. He would leach the oil out of his oil paints, scrubbing and stippling monotype's viscous ink, layering and grinding pastel so hard the paper furred. He was infected by the execution. The late pastels are built by accretion, like coral reefs. In fact, the artist we have met this evening is not a painter of a slice of life who caught candid, spontaneous scenes on the fly. Which brings me to my last image, a remarkable study of Laura's hands for the Bellelli family. Here we have not one, but two limp hands coexisting with the same kinds of scrubbed and rasped areas of paint that I've suggested this evening have their roots in a desire to paint as painting is done on walls. This preparatory work doesn't capture a headlong, assured movement any more than the remarkable lithograph of horses and jockeys does. The effect strikes the eye, but does not provide it with a legible narrative. The eye is attracted by the rhyming movements, the note of impatience struck by some figures, but not by others. And yet, the viewer is held, satisfied not by a deepening yield of insight, but by the fascinating irresolution. And it is this irresolution that is the key to the enigmatic and private painter I've discussed this evening. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions. Any queries or questions? Thank you for your attention, of course. Hello.
This had to do with the very first image that you showed of the head of a man and a woman. And one of my friends and I, docent, were wondering, the faces were smudged. And it was a monotype, and we were wondering, maybe perhaps your opinion, as to whether that was intentionally done or part of the monotype process that he was experimenting with, but it seemed almost unprofessional.
Oh, that's such a great observation. I completely agree with you. This is such a captivating and exasperating work because it's not quite because He seems to, in my humble opinion, he seems, I'm just going to go back to it. I know there's an easier way to do this, but at least you're kind of getting So my feeling is that, he was such an experimenter, and, this is something, of course, Michel Faux will talk about. He was such an experimenter with material. He's known to have really preferred a rag when he was working on a monotype. And my feeling is that this is a rag, just swiping across, and he just left it as is. He left it as is because he couldn't. I mean, who knows if it might originally have been a mistake? But I feel it's hard to sort of say that it's completely inadvertent because of the way the forehead of the woman is so incredibly well defined by that swipe. Just across her brows and then going into her ear. So it's a very kind of like measured and at the same time just so kind of gesture. But yeah, a marvelous work and one, we can only imagine the mind that made it.
I'd hang it on my wall anyway.
Oh, absolutely. Same here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You spoke a little bit just at the end about Degas' tendency to alter the physical support, right? Now,
Yes.
In the preparatory study you showed for the Bellelli family portrait, it looked like there was a strip at the bottom that was, I couldn't tell whether it was actually physically separate or whether there was just like a line drawn across.
Well.
Am I imagining that?
I think you're.
Maybe misremembering?
No, Degas was so constantly, cutting up works and putting. Again, I'm sure there's an easier way to do this, but
yeah, I sent you straight to the other end of the
it's actually it's a nice. It's like a quick retrospective. It's like you're. Yeah, exactly. Excuse me. Oh yeah. Yeah, and
as if he might have been thinking about the very issue you were talking about. What happens when we vary the amount of foreground we have here?
I think, wow, I have to put that into the talk immediately. That is such a great observation. And he was so, cavalier about the way he could cut up and chop into and slice along edges in particular, that I think that's exactly what he was doing. Yeah, I think, I can't believe I didn't notice that. But I had to come to Williamstown. That's why I had to, Williamsburg, excuse me. I lived for a year in Williamstown, I'm sorry. So, that's a fantastic observation. Great, thanks, Charles.
Your point.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I'm still not sure if I figured him out, but thank you so much for coming along this afternoon. Thank you.